So the project you're talking about in Florence is the one about Brancusi.
Yes, I don't think we should limit it to Florence, of course, because it really is, it's like a walking road movie, and it concerns the whole of the European landscape at the very beginning of the 20th century.
So what happened? What's happening during this long walk?
Well, it is supposed to be the truth, but the more you read, of course, the more you research. I mean, there's no diary, there's no journal. There are one or two photographs and there are one or two drawings. So nobody in the world, maybe apart from his parents, knew he existed. And I suppose without in any way maybe insulting a culture, I think if you want to be a world serious artist, to grow up in Romania at the beginning of the 20th century is not a very good idea. You want to be in the real center of cultural activity, and of course that was certainly happening in Paris in 1900 and the first decade, well, certainly up till the First World War. People like Modigliani were already there, Gertrude Stein and her brother were already there. The Americans hadn't yet arrived, we had to wait a bit longer for that, but Picasso and Braque were visiting all the time, and so there was a gradual establishment of, should we say, culturally sophisticated people. And Brancusi, who had some ability at, I suppose, a cultural identity associated with three dimensions. There is a tradition of folk craft and whittling wood, very arboreal country, many forests, it's Transylvania almost, the land of Dracula, etc. And so with a little minor encouragement, because his father was a farmer, and he, as a small boy, aged from 5 onwards, used to have to spend the summers up in the Transylvanian mountains looking after sheep. So he was very isolated, had to live off the land, so he was used to living off the land, and he was very solitary, and I think as a character he's very solitary. He was probably a little shy, a little reticent, maybe a bit sort of misanthropic too, I suppose. And so he decided, when he was about 26, that if he was going to take himself seriously, he wasn't or shouldn't waste his time in the backwoods of Romania. And it's about 2,000 miles from where he lived. And so he set out walking. He didn't have any money for a train fare. That's how the story goes. Though the more you read into it, I mean, it's very difficult to prove because he didn't keep a diary and there's no journal, that occasionally he might take short trips on a train. And what I've done, he always takes advantage of the landscape. So he thumbs a lift to farmers, he steals a bike, he rows down rivers and so on. So anything to forward his progress. It's about, I think, 1,800 kilometers. So it's quite a way. Yeah, I think he took his time. He was enjoying the countryside. And he had this belief about truth to materials. So unlike, somebody like Rodin, for example, who, would deliberately turn marble into flesh, if he's depicting something like Icarus, he tried to pretend that bronze was feathers. But Brancusi wasn't going to have any of this sort of rubbish. There was a way marble had to be marble and bronze was bronze. So as he walked through Europe, he made sculpture of all the available materials, which was tree trunks and branches and leaves and stones and gravel and sand. And when he went through the Alps, where there was snow and ice, he was very good at making snowmen. So all the time it's an apprenticeship. I tend to think, it's rather nice to imagine that since he went to so many places in the wilderness, if you look very hard, you'll still find his sculptures there after over 100 years. That's a fantasy, of course, because most of the materials he made were very perishable, and I'm sure they would have disappeared a long, long time ago. So the film is certainly about Brancusi as the major, I think, transforming sculptor of the 20th century. Sculptor's never been the same since he created what he did. So it's a film about sculpture, so that means three-dimensional sculpture in a two-dimensional medium, which is cinema. How do you cope with that? It's an enjoyment of extraordinarily beautiful landscapes. You know, he stayed away from cities. He always walked through wild places, up mountains, you know, in moors, etc., etc. So it's an apprenticeship of a very important sculpture, a sign of the times, and it's also a walk. I don't know about you, but you know, throughout my life, I've thoroughly enjoyed walking in natural landscapes. And I think that Brancusi has been responsible for that big period of art in the middle of the 20th century called land art, where all sorts of people were actually going out and changing the landscape, weren't just making representations of it. So in England, for example, there are a whole series of people in the 60s and 70s who walked and then recorded their walk. And I think it's also relevant now because, I'm not so sure now, but certainly 3 or 4 years ago, Europe was full of people on the move. They were walking, all trying to find a better life. And in a curious way, I suppose culturally and artistically, Mr. Brancusi was also trying to find a more valuable life where he was understood and could practice what he wanted. So we always keep making that comparison because I don't think there's any point making historical movies unless you're also talking about the present. So though he's walking throughout this whole 120-minute movie, you can see other people are walking too. So I hope our audiences will make that connection between, should we say, 1905 and, let's say, you know, 2015.
There was another artist who walked a long way from Munich to Paris. It was Werner Herzog, the filmmaker.
Yeah.
Were you in a way?
No, but there have been a lot of people. I mean, a lot of English people. Have you ever heard of George Borrow? He walked from London all the way to the coast of Spain. William Wordsworth, for example, is an extraordinary walker. You know, he walked something like 30 or 40 miles every day. He had a rather strange habit that when he had a companion. Pardon? Yes, indeed. But Samuel Taylor Coleridge was another one, and William Hazlitt was another one. So the English have always been great walkers.
And how all this comes into the form of a film, and how much did you already shoot, and how much?
Well, yeah, you must be familiar. I don't know what the Italian for picaresque is. It's the same word? It's I've invented probably about 30 or 40 little incidents. Some of them are erotic. He has erotic adventures with a series of females. Some of them are tragic. He has fights on the way. You know, he's a stranger, so he's often attacked as a tramp. Some he has sentimental relationships, and there's one big love interest as well. So I've written all these little tiny incidents. Some of them are connected and some of them are not, in the picaresque tradition, which is, you know, central to European literature. And we put them together. And I think the structure is basically the seasons, as I've suggested. He sets off in one spring, in the lambing season, and then walks indeed through the spring, the summer, the autumn, and he ends up in Switzerland in the Alps, where he gets very seriously ill and has to be taken in by nuns in a nunnery. He recovers, then he walks into France. He enters France somewhere, probably like near Colmar somewhere, and then he walks up the center of France, and as I say, he arrives in Paris on Bastille Day.
Okay. Yeah. And is Italy involved in any way?
Well, no, that's what's rather strange. You know, we have a co-production. There are Swiss, French, and Italians. But he never walked through Italy. But you know how films work, you go where the money is.
Mm-hmm.
I made my Nertflix movie before Nertflix was ever invented. You might remember, I think we knew one another. I was making this huge project called the Tutsluper Suitcases. But it was so far ahead of its time, though I think it went to over 400 film festivals very successfully. It was an absolute failure in the cinema on the corner street because it was just too advanced. And I still think, looking back, that what we did in the Tutsluper Suitcase in terms of vocabulary, grammar, and syntax was much more exciting than we're now seeing on Netflix. You know, Netflix is just basic cinema again, isn't it? You know, we have a text-based industry. You as a writer know this. Our cinema is all about text, 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 and very, very little, really, really, about image. So most films are simply illustrated text, which isn't good enough. Illustrated text is not cinema. Cinema is not illustrated text. And I'm still trying to drum that home. Yeah, I still believe that's true. I mean, two simple things. Do you ever watch silent cinema? Anybody in this room watch silent cinema? Nobody watches silent cinema, apart from Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin at Christmas if you've got small kids. Or if you're an archivist and want to know what Chicago tram cars looked like in 1921. But most people don't watch silent cinema anymore for instruction or for entertainment. That lasted from, 1895 to 1929, 31 years. All gone, all disappeared. And the rest of cinema is going the same way. In my pocket and in your pocket, we have a smartphone. And that's the future. You know, film festivals are getting, there are over 5,000 film festivals, I think in Europe alone. 5,000 film festivals just in Europe. Just consider how many there are. But who's going to them? Less and less and less people. And they're perhaps the only places where you can actually see films which are bigger and noisier than you are. And the second thing is most people watch their cinema on their own or with their nearest and dearest on small screens, either when they're lying in bed, sitting on the sofa, or sitting at their office desk. We don't watch films in company very largely anymore. So these big characteristics of the cinema of my fathers and forefathers disappeared. So we're going to have to reconsider very seriously what the future of cinema is. And it isn't in cinemas anymore. And there's a lady standing beside you who runs a film festival, so she better make sure she changes her mind, because in 10 years she'll be out of a job.
You said that when you get 80 years old, you want to commit suicide.
I could do that. I live in Amsterdam. It's very easy.
Yeah, I know that. That's why I ask you, do you really want to think about
Well, do you think about it? Does, especially men, women have a little more chance than we do because they can become useful grandmothers. But a grandfather's really a waste of space, isn't it? A waste of time. Nobody ever creates anything of any interest, of any value, after 80. You know, Picasso made one or two good paintings, Tiziano made one or two good paintings too, but everybody else who's significantly cultural created their things ages ago. You know, Wittgenstein was finished when he was 32. Einstein had done everything he needed to do by the time he was 28. If you're an Olympic swimmer, you know, forget it. After 19, you're finished. Why hang around? There are too many people in the world. There's over 70 billion people in the world. You know, it's the young people now we need to rely on for the notions of future civilization. Don't be selfish. Get out of the way. The resources are very limited.
I hope not. I hope you will care about yourself. You will produce more and more when you are...
Well, I don't know. There's that famous Portuguese filmmaker who died at 106.
Yeah.
But if you look at his last 6 films, weren't they boring and weren't they all the same?
Oliveira.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, he amused himself. I presume he amused those people.
Nice to talk with.
Okay, but that's not making the films of any value.
I thank you very much.
My pleasure.